Good morning, Dhruv. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Jamie. How are you?
Yeah, great, great. Well, it's a pleasure to get the chance to talk to you on this series of Sentientist Conversations. And it was really triggered by a series of articles you wrote that I thought were fascinating about this often fiery debate, particularly in the animal advocacy world, about abolitionism versus welfarism. So we might come back to that later on. But I'm fascinated to understand your philosophical journey too. And as you know, this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest and most important philosophical questions. What's real? How should we understand the universe best? And just as importantly, who matters? How do we set our moral scope? Who warrants our compassion? And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which suggests that on answering the first question, we should take a naturalistic approach, using evidence and reason. And on the second question about moral scope, that we should think about sentience as being the grounding, so that every sentient being, any being that can experience suffering or flourishing or anything really, should count in our moral consideration and should get our compassion. But I have the pleasure in these conversations of talking to people, whether they agree or disagree with that worldview. So it'll be really interesting to know your own philosophical story and where that's led you to now. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you introduce yourself?
I'll try and keep it very simple. My name is Dhruv Makwana. I was born in India, raised in Scotland. I'm currently studying for a PhD at the University of Cambridge in computer science, psychology, philosophy, animal advocacy. These are all things that I consider hobbies, interests, but which are taking up increasingly more of my mind and time. And I'm quite enjoying this actually. And I'd just like to say thank you for reaching out and giving me this opportunity. It seems like a lot of fun, so I'm ready to get into it.
Yeah, brilliant. Sounds good. And those topics have that habit of just encroaching more and more on your mind space over time. So good luck balancing them with your studies. Yeah, great. Thank you. And I could hear the Scottish twang there. There was a hint. There's a hint. Yeah. So let's get into these big philosophical questions. So the first one is this question of what's real and how can we come to know things. So for many of my guests, that's a story about where they grew up originally in maybe a more mystical, spiritual, or religious context, or one that was maybe atheistic or naturalistic or agnostic or more scientific minded, or a mix of the two, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time, if it has. So yeah, you can wind the clock back as far as you like. It'd be fascinating to know your epistemological journey and where you are now.
Sure. So being born in India and having moved to Scotland at a relatively young age, there was a bit of moving around. So I got a good mix of two cultures that way. So at home, it was very much traditional Hindu Indian culture, where we have a temple in the house. We do some sort of prayers in the morning. Maybe that definitely got less regular as we got older. And then outside, it was kind of just classic Western materialism, science, all that sort of thing. And my first introduction to this kind of thinking was actually Darren Brown, his books Tricks of the Mind. So I was always interested in psychology, that sort of magic, hypnotism for some reason. And I read Tricks of the Mind, and he talks a lot about atheism in there, and especially in the Christian context, and also about magic and charlatanism, right? So it kind of started to pick at and unravel these threads of belief, dogma. How do we know something's real? Homeopathy, all those sorts of different kind of things in a very accessible and entertaining way. So I recommend the book to anyone. And based in that book, literally was a reading list of recommended books. And so I think it was for my 12th birthday. I was like, I just want a bunch of these books. So it was quite expensive actually.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I got through a good chunk of them. One of the ones that at least I remember right now was uh, Michael Shermer's Why People Believe Weird Things. That's a dense book for a 12-year-old to get through, but I did eventually manage to finish it. And there was another one by, I can't remember at the top of my head, but it talked about kind of GMOs, that sort of thing, the perhaps unwarranted skepticism on that side of thing. And I'm not saying I have a strong opinion on that particular subject or any of the other things right now, but it did really like the thing I remember learning about that from that book was like the Golden Rice Project and how that was shot down just because it was a GMO thing rather than any concrete safety concerns. This is my recollection of it. If there's listeners who are screaming at their devices right now, do not take me as an authority on this. But that sets, I think, quite a nice context for the skepticism that kind of came in. But at the same time, I was a teenager, it was angsty, sad. School wasn't necessarily difficult, but it wasn't easy either. Academically, it was easy. I found myself very fluent with physics and maths, but also there's a little bit of bullying, that sort of thing. And also there's just this cultural thing that any immigrant children will know of, which is you kind of feel like half and half, and the halves don't really mix. And there's this sense of value of transcendence, which is something that, like, if you look at cross-cultural studies of values, for example, they find like 6 which are common across all cultures, and then articulating that feeling in those terms, there's this kind of value of transcendence that was just missing. Like, it's like, it'd be really nice if God was real. If really nice if this.
Yeah.
I switched back and forth. So my parents got and my sister, they got more and more religious as I grew up, especially towards the end of my school. And so, and especially when my family in India, most of the time we'd be going around Diwali. And so I could see the appeal of the fun of the festivals and the kind of the coming together. But I couldn't see any reason or logic in any of the rituals or like whys and so on and so forth. So it was just entirely unsatisfying on that front. And likewise, it's not like the Western materialists have any really great answers on how to live per se. So I'll fast forward a bit. I'm in the middle of my second year at university, studying my undergraduate, also at Cambridge, also computer science. And I'm at this point clinically depressed, mostly due to self-esteem issues. And I realize, okay, I think I must be doing something wrong because I don't remember life being this difficult. So this is where I start to get into philosophy, mostly Western philosophy. I'd studied a bit before in school. I remember enjoying that. So I figured, well, I enjoyed this before. Let me try this again, see what happens. There I discovered the Stoics. I discovered lots of different ideas. I think the 2 ones that really kind of resonated were the Stoics and Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is often associated with nihilism, and I think that's a little bit of a caricature because it's kind of like a very positive nihilism, right? Like when he talks about what was it, the camel, the stages of progression as the camel, the dragon or lion or something like that, and then the child. Purely the camel is the thing that's been burdened down by the world. The dragon or the lion, or I forget, is like the defiant no. But the child is a playful yes to the world, right? And so that spoke to me, as well as the Stoics, which I continue to do in personally and as a volunteer activity for other people.
Did you ever look into the existentialist stuff? Because that seems to have a bit of a link in that it sort of recognizes the essential nihilism and the ridiculousness of the universe, but still takes quite a positive sense of, we might as well find our own way regardless. But was that something that resonated as well?
Sure, good question. So I came across a little bit towards the end. So I was most of my studies were through philosophy, Philosophize This podcast, and the School of Life. So it's not necessarily particularly academic sources, but I think they get at the essence where sometimes it's hard to kind of come across in other sources. And then also then going from using that as a springboard and learning more about it just through articles and videos and all that sort of stuff. So very self-directed exploratory learning, which I think is one of the best kinds. I did come across that. It didn't really ring true. I couldn't quite follow the continental philosophers. I don't. It's not a dunk on them. Like I just couldn't really. Like, for example, I tried to read. Somebody once got me as a present. The Plague by Camus. I read that, and it just didn't really. I couldn't see. It's like, well, what's going on here? I think the most useful thing I got out of it was understanding of when COVID came around. I was like, oh, I see. It's starting to make more sense now.
Yeah, the context for
context. And then after I graduated, I was kept applying Stoicism. I'd gone to therapy. Things were precarious but stable, let's say.
Yeah.
Was in my personal life. And there were issues, specifically like emotionally charged issues, a breakup, which often is the case, which just did not seem amenable to being logicked out of. So whilst the rest of my life was probably just fine, and professionally I was doing quite well, financially I was doing well, I was just like, I'm still kind of stuck on this and I don't want to be stuck. So I started at that point, this was inspired by a talk by Akala, the rapper, and kind of his command and familiarity with both, Western education canon, but also the roots of where he came from, right? As Jamaicans, more broadly, the African kind of schooling. I was like, actually, there might be something within the old religious traditions that I grew up with and was familiar with. And so I just started working through that History of Philosophy in India podcast. And I just figured, well, there might be something here. And if not, at least I'm learning a more balanced view on philosophy. And so at that point, I started reading the ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata. So for some context, that's about the critical edition translated is about 10 volumes, about 2.5 million words. So it's it's long going.
Work. Yeah.
It's serious work. And I got about halfway through, but it was an earnest, because the reason I wanted to do that was I wanted to really understand the context of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita, as many readers might be familiar with, is probably the most well-recognized book in Indian philosophy, not just Hindu, and especially in Hindu philosophy, right? And it's, each tradition will try and co-opt it for its own. It seems to me, from a historical perspective, a very interesting syncretic mix of different kind of traditions, Sankhya, Yoga, and Bhakti. Not going to get into those because it's been a while and it's probably a bit too much of a tangent. But the context of it is that Arjuna is a warrior and he is opposite the battlefield against his own cousins and his own family, right? So some of his family are his side, some of his family is on his other side. On his chariot with him, his chariot driver is Krishna. And so Krishna is well known and well established to be in the story, and obviously in general, Hindu literature, like the creator of the universe, the God, the supreme Atman from which the individual Atman comes from or is part and parcel of. So it's quite a good advantage to have, but he's not fighting. He can only advise and he can only drive the chariot. And so he gets this moment of existential doubt before the war, which is just seeing the two families lined up against each other. And he's like, what's the point of this? Like, it doesn't seem like the kingdom would be worth it if I do this. Right? Why? And this more specifically is like, why should I act if the fruits of the acts are not my own? Right? Which is very it's a very good question to ask, because the Stoics often, are famous for saying there's some things in your control, some things are not in your control. What's up to us is our judgments, are what we say, and our actions. What's not up to us is everything else. But it kind of doesn't really get at to, well, then why should I care about the external things, or what is the motivation for doing that? I wanted to understand not just the answer, but the context of that, right? Really get a feel for what was it like to be Arjuna in that situation? What had his family gone through? What had his parents gone through? What had he done? And turns out quite a lot. And like, how much had they tried to avoid the war? Quite a lot. You see all of that, and despite all that, they're there, and he's kind of a very brave and very capable warrior, essentially losing his shit at the last minute. So I wanted to do that, and I read the Bhagavad Gita. I did find it helpful. But I also came across Buddhism at that time. And through not just my own philosophical readings, but through some friends who had recommended it. And I can't remember why, but I remember being very angry at one point for a few weeks, months. And some books, what was it? Yeah, there was one which I was recommended. I read, it seemed to help. There were more interesting links in terms of logic with Buddhism and computer science I didn't expect, and was quite pleasantly surprised by. This is the work of Paraconsistent Logics with Graham Priest. And So I just kept digging, right? And I got eventually encouraged to go to a Buddhist monastery. So turns out the oldest Buddhist monastery in the West is actually in Scotland. It was established by Akong Rinpoche and Chogyam Trungpa. So Chogyam Trungpa is extremely famous, potentially a bit infamous as well, in the West, as, for example, being one of the prime teachers of uh, Tibetan Buddhism in the 60s. For example, one of his famous students is Pema Chodron. So I went there and I just stayed for 2 weeks, and it wasn't particularly like, it wasn't a retreat. It was just staying. It's kind of like a hostel with a temple attached, right? That's the best way to describe it. And the thing that I saw there more than anything else, of course, there was courses on philosophy during the day, and it was just nice to talk to people. Well, it was two things. One is, do you come here often? It is a really boring question in most contexts, but really interesting in the context of a Buddhist monastery, right? So everyone had their own story, and they had their own suffering, and it was just so much worse than mine, right? And this isn't, well, it wasn't like a comparison to make me feel bad about myself. I was like, whoa, okay. We've talked about people who've gone through 2 sets of divorces and lost both sets of kids at the same time, and they haven't, they've just given away most of their material possessions because they realize that it's not worth the mental stress of trying to cling on to that. And even to the point where they've admitted, look, the kids are too far gone. They've been indoctrinated against me by their mothers. And so, like, they're welcome. And I obviously I miss them, but this is what people were saying to me. But like, there's not much I can do, right? And I have to accept the situation. And that's just one amongst many other stories, but that stood out. The one is just like that kind of first noble truth that the Buddhists talk about. There is dissatisfaction and discontentment in this world. And then the second one was the volunteers there. And I'd been reading about, and I tried to be implementing in my own life, this kind of values of patience, generosity, focus on loving as opposed to being loved, right? So these very nice values. But this was for the first time that I'd seen this in action in such a skilled and almost a virtuoso way of living. And it really resonated me. People who were happy to see me day by day, like they were just like, they'd say good morning, Dhruv, and they were just genuinely happy to see me that day. If I helped out in the kitchen after lunch and with the washing up, they were genuinely thankful. And it wasn't a show. These were people who had, their own difficult lives. Again, things like raising children with severe disabilities who are now adults, young people who were just confused about whether or not, having quit university, all sorts of different things. And yet they just were content and happy, and they'd gone through the work, and you could see that. So having left that, I was in a very peaceful state of mind. So if you haven't meditated, so I tried meditation before, it didn't really stick, like twice, but this time, you're just in a context where meditating 2 hours a day is just part of the schedule, so it doesn't seem that much. But I remember the afterglow of just peace and quiet seemed to last for like a month, which is the longest that's lasted for me since. It was I have an email from the time, so like, if I needed to, I could like find my words, and that got me into meditation, right? And then this was early 2020, and so by the time I was studying, then I was doing meditation. I was also studying positive psychology on a online course, Science of Wellbeing, by Laurie Santos, who's a professor at Yale. And you can probably kind of tell, it's like my shift had been shifted. Yeah, my focus had shifted not so much on the why and the existential, but it's like, it seems to me there's like some things that work and some things that don't. Very pragmatic approach. Let me just try the things that seem to work, right? There's like some science behind this. People often say, oh, aiming at happiness is like a bad idea. And I'm just like, no, I just disagree. Like, I just disagree. Like, okay, fine. Like, you need an appropriate notion of happiness. And from, I guess, my cultural, I just like instinctively knew that material possessions and temporary experience is not the way to go. And secondly, you need to have an understanding of what works and why, right? And so this is where the scientific method very much helps, but also an openness to trying different traditions and saying, look, there's like a lot of folk wisdom in there. Sometimes people accidentally discover things within ancient communities which are relevant. Doesn't mean automatically validate everything, but like humans aren't dumb. It's not like we got any dumber or smarter in the past 3,000 years. We just accumulated. We found a good way of accumulating and building on that momentum, as far as I can tell. Like hunter-gatherers in those days probably had the equivalent of a botanical PhD just to survive. Right. That is like that is a serious amount of knowledge.
That's proper pragmatic wisdom right there.
Yeah, exactly. And so they dealt with much worse circumstances. So to the idea to like offhand dismiss entire category of culture seemed to be a little bit it's understandable, because there's a lot of shit that comes with the good. Like I'm first one to say that.
Yeah.
But there's a baby in the bathwater, as always. And so it was very much a focus on how, at this time during the pandemic, for reasons, I accidentally moved to New Zealand. So I was on holiday, the pandemic happened, and I got, I guess, quote unquote, stuck there.
You didn't have a prepper bunker built into a mountainside.
No.
Apocalypse.
I was in Tekapo, which is in like the middle of the South Island, when they announced 36 hours to find a place to spend the next 5 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and I was due to start a PhD in about 2 weeks from then. So, or 4 weeks from then. So, at first I was like, I don't even have a computer, let alone a stable internet connection here. Access to medicine, that sort of thing. So worked out just fine. And I mentioned this because eventually I came across, so by this time I'd already, and this is a slightly different tangential thread, but for environmental reasons initially, had transitioned to veganism, or at least a vegan diet. I remember the Joseph Poor study came out in around 2018. It was very publicized, which was like, oh, a vegan diet reduces your environmental footprint from food-related emissions for about 70%. And the vegetarian one, which is the one that I grew up with, was 63%. And this question really puzzled me, was like, I already live in a high-income country. I've done pretty well for myself. Do I have any reason to justify that extra 7%? It's like, what is it about me that justifies that extra 7%? I just thought and I thought and I thought, and I just couldn't figure anything out. So it's not the usual kind of entry, but I just couldn't. And so eventually I was like, well, I guess I should start cutting back, right? At least on the dairy, which is because Hindu vegetarians typically, or sometimes they don't consume eggs. So, and along that way, there's like, I'd come across various replacements, like for ice cream, for milks, for yogurts, and so on and so forth. So I remember once I tried a vegan pizza with vegan cheese, I was like, this is fine. Like this satisfies my pizza itch. Like I have, first at 7%, now this, I basically run out of things that I can say I would miss. Like, so eventually over a few months, I transitioned to vegan diet. Then I watched Carnage by Simon Amstell, which I would highly recommend. Like, it's very funny.
Yeah.
It gets better with age. It gets like, especially the stuff about the pandemics that really prescient almost.
Oh yeah.
So I say this because during my time in New Zealand, I came across Earthling Ed on YouTube, and in lockdown didn't have anything better to do than to get radicalized. So I did.
In a good direction, fortunately.
Yeah, I think so. Not in the sense of I was very much like people can do their own thing, that's fine. But then I started to appreciate that there is a moral force to this issue.
And before we come on to that part of the story, you've already demonstrated beautifully how difficult it is to separate this sort of what's real and what's true question from the really important questions of how to live a good life and and ethics as well. And I think there's a message in that in itself, right? That separation is difficult and probably inappropriate either as well. But before we move off that sort of what's real question, let me sort of try and summarize where I think you might be, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. So when it comes to the strict sort of natural versus supernatural type thing, my sense is you're quite naturalistically minded. You're quite skeptical about the existence of supernatural stuff, gods and spirits, heaven and hell, and those types of things. But at the same time, you feel and felt enormous power from the community, the connection, the ritual, and also the sense of transcendence that comes through a variety of different religious worldviews that have, power and relevance in your life. Is that?
That's fair to say up until that point that I was in New Zealand. So there's more. There's this epistemological or metaphysical, like, quote unquote, journey, and then there's this ethical journey, and they're just in not lockstep, but they're developing in parallel. And okay, so I say radicalized. So I find this activist community in Wellington, New Zealand, and very, within the space of a few weeks, once lockdown was lifted, I go out and meet them. I literally first, like, as a stranger, I show up, but eventually, slowly, they're very friendly, and they're close friends of mine now. I still consider them to be very close friends. And the nice thing about that was a very group community. It's not necessarily like you find individuals that you resonate with, but you find a group that you resonate with. And some individuals more than others, but that's the joy of a group, right? And along the same time, I came across Peter Singer, obviously because of the ethics stuff. I read the book The Life You Can Save, and that really, it took me for a spin, right? In terms of, it just put me in my place, and probably quite an like fair way. It's like, oh no, there's things that I can do better, like even the bare minimum in terms of helping those who are the humans that are at least most disenfranchised in the world.
It can be psychologically difficult, though. I don't know what your reaction to it was, but
in terms of
because it can almost take you in a couple of directions. One is it can give you a sense of your potential power to do good in the world, and that can be enormously positive and engaging. But it can also lead people to a sense of powerful demandingness that I can't live up to, and the scale of the problems of the world, and a sort of futility and fatalism as well. It can be difficult to navigate for some people.
Oh, for sure. For some reason, demandingness never really got to me in the same way. As in, I always thought that, okay, 10%, the things that he advocates for, at least in my case at the time, it would be 5% as a PhD student on a stipend. I was like, well, I think this is reasonable. And, he outlines, it's like, oh, you give a little, see how it goes, and then you increase it more. And my thinking on that involved, for sure, but the demandingness never really hit home. What really hit home was, like, I was still psychologically related, I'd say, to the person that had suffered at university so deeply. And it very quickly became obvious to me that the thing that was bad was not necessarily the causes, but the fact that these people are suffering. That just hit home, where there's a specific sentence in The Life You Can Save where it's like, poverty is often accompanied by a powerful state of helplessness and despair, right? And then he goes on to describe the sorts of things that be accompanied with, right? And I was like, well, no one deserves to feel like that, regardless of the material conditions that they're in. And so that was my introduction to the effective altruist community as well. At the same time, I came across, so I'd already read Sam Harris's book. It's a short book, Waking Up, Guide to Spirituality Without Religion. And there he talks about metaphysics of personal identity, neuroscience, and also the baby in the bathwater when it comes to religion and spirituality. I found it very interesting. I don't think it had an effect on me until much later, when I was reading, and I came across Derek Parfit's work. So Parfit's quite a dense read, and I don't think I would recommend anyone read his exactly. So my copy is just out of reach of my hand right there. So I wouldn't recommend people read him directly most of the time. I think there's some pretty good summaries out there. But he's really entertaining. So, if you like a good thought experiment, if you are able to skim through the arguments and get the general gist without getting lost in the details, it is worth it, 100%. By this point, and I am also, for some whatever weird reason, really drawn to this physicist Carlo Rovelli and his book, The Order of Time. So both of these books just happened to be in the house that I was living in. I moved house while I was in New Zealand, and I just by coincidence happened to land in a house full of effective altruists. And they were also good friends of mine. So, or became good friends of mine as a result of me staying there just a few months. So that's kind of how I learned. That was my introduction, was just conversations, right? Over breakfast, over dinner, etc. So at this point, I'm now reading physics, and then somewhere in the order of time, Carlo Rovelli's like, oh yeah, like even there's a interpretation of quantum mechanics where all the properties that we could take to be quote unquote fundamental, um, like mass, charge, so on and so forth, uh, you can view them as existing in and of itself. And then there's like the Copenhagen interpretation versus this, that, and the other. It's like, okay, is it a wave function? Is it multiverse? Or does it indeterminate and then it collapses? Or there's another view, on the metaphysical view on the situation, which is that these properties only exist in interaction with another system. Alongside that, he's just talking about, well, cats don't exist metaphysically in the universe in that sense. There's no, it's a thing that we impose onto the universe, and likewise we do that to ourselves, quote unquote. So somehow within this line of thinking, it leads to this view on self. I'd already come across it from the neuroscience perspective thanks to Sam Harris. I'm reading Derek Parfit, and like, okay, the same thing comes up in terms of Hume and his Derek Parfit's interesting thought experiments. And obviously, this is very familiar from all the reading I've done around Buddhism. So now I have 4 extremely diverse points of view pointing to this very strange thing about notions of identity, right? And one of them, which claims that this thing is a sticking point per se in terms of contentment and happiness. To recap, that is neuroscience. I'm not saying it's definitively resolved, but if you listen to a neuroscientist talk about perceptions of reality and self, you're like, oh, this is very familiar. Hume and Parfit in the Western philosophical tradition, I mean, a good chunk of the Eastern philosophical traditions, including the Buddha, especially. And surprisingly, one interpretation of quantum mechanics, as proposed by Carlo Rovelli, relation quantum mechanics, and they all seem to like somehow converge on this weird conclusion of identity from very different conclusions. And sure, they're not entirely independent, as in there's probably been some influence some ways, but that's very strange. That's the sort of thing which makes you go, I wasn't expecting this. And then obviously the Buddha takes that one step further. It's like, okay, this is true, and also this is one of the reasons that you're upset, right? So Buddha famously, maybe kind of, I saw an article on this, which is mistranslated as saying, I teach suffering, and I teach only suffering and the end of suffering. He says it's more supposed to be like, I indeed teach suffering and the end of suffering, which is slightly different because he taught a bunch of other stuff as well. But his main thrust was, being troubled by open metaphysical questions is not because you don't have an answer to them, it's because you expect the answer or you're asking the question. I had seen this in my own experience. So I also got involved with a local religious group that was running a yoga studio and volunteer kitchen. They weren't very religious per se. It was just a nice group of people to hang out with. Vegan kitchen, again, that was very useful. And just lovely people. They had a good time, right? And it was, I think, a few months into that, I just realized I'd been stopped. I had stopped being bothered by these big existential questions. And somebody once asked me, I was like, did you find an answer? It's like, no. Then what happened? It's like, it's more like I just stopped asking the question.
yeah.
Because I didn't need to, because like contentment is like by definition and by experience for sure. It's like, okay. So my most of my, so I have some ideas on this for sure, but they're all accompanied by big and it's quite a fun, I don't know.
I think that's a great conclusion to have come to. Yeah.
So I like, in terms of metaphysics, I'd say, like, that thing of relation quantum mechanics, I won't go into too much further because it's been a while since I read it. But it seems to point into this idea that things, looking for a foundation is really dicey subject, right? Logically speaking, and also in terms of one interpretation of quantum mechanics. Now, this is not to admit all woo, for sure, but it's like people very much like the idea of like an objective reality out there, and that's stable, independent, and all that sort of stuff. And I'm not even going to try and deny it. I'm just like, and obviously this is not a new idea. The skeptics in any tradition, Eastern or Westerns, have been going for, we have no way of knowing what that is. Like, basically, like, if you refine your mind and pay attention enough, you quickly realize that like from the inside, right? So you can kind of probe this quote unquote from the outside with neuroscience perspectives, right? But you also realize by doing meditation quite a lot, which is something that I have been doing, how these constructs are built in your mind piece by piece, how this complicated jigsaw puzzle that you call reality comes together from the inside. Because these concepts often go together, right? And because they co-occur all the time, you think that there's some sort of unit of force behind them, right? I'm seeing this microphone, I'm touching this microphone, and therefore I think that these things, there is a microphone which is unifying these perceptions. But, and this is strange, but it can happen, if you're to have an experience of this microphone, you're holding this microphone, right? Where you're feeling the sensations, you're looking at it, you have this concept microphone, but the integrative concept just disappears because that part of your mind just relaxes or whatever. You're like, oh, okay, clearly that was an additional part of the experience that wasn't there, right? So you now realize that your experience is constituted of three things. It's not just seeing the microphone, as I said before, seeing the microphone, feeling the microphone, and also this kind of sense, that concept of microphone, right? But you can have those experiences, quote unquote, direct experiences without this conceptual overlay. And it's very trippy when that happens.
And does that link to, I guess, the physics fact that ultimately that microphone is really a collection of perturbations of a wave function or a collection of quarks? Or so is it a recognition that we're applying a mental construct to something that may or may not be out there?
I think so. Like, let me phrase it another way. I was at a retreat, and you're paying attention to your experiences moment to moment, mindfulness, classic mindfulness, old school mindfulness. And I remember saying to the meditation teacher there, I'm looking at peanut butter because that's one of the things I quite like, and they have it in the mornings every morning. And I'm like, if you ask me what peanut butter tastes like I can't really, that's a meaningless question, right? Because I can only see it right now, very obviously, I can only see it right now. And when I can taste it, I can't see it. And somehow these two things are linked together into one concept, right? Like literally, when you can observe this yourself, if you're putting food into your mouth, there's a moment where you stop seeing your food, and yet you're still associating the taste with that image. And those two things actually don't occur. They quickly follow one or the other. That's the instance of, but your brain just stitches them together. And so I was just trying to describe this thing to this teacher, and I was like, yeah, peanut butter still tastes good, but it's only when it's in my mouth. Like I have no reason to want it, or kind of, and this is interesting because this goes directly back to some of the things that Buddha says about craving. This craving is essentially like this fabrication or this assignment of more solidity than there is, right? So if I recognize that tastes yummy, but it's only going to taste yummy when it's in my mouth, so to speak, speaking in relative terms. So, but it's not yummy right now, so it's fine if I don't have it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And how much? So for me, one of the perspectives that helps put this stuff in place for me is just the awareness that we're another type of evolved animal. And I think that can lead into understanding so many of the psychological things we struggle with, because in a way we evolve for one set of adaptive purposes, and we happen to have developed cognitive capabilities that can give us lots of other problems that aren't really related to our adaptiveness at all. So whether that's agency detection, or all of the classical things around groupishness and motivated reasoning, and and existential angst, right? I mean, that's a sort of unwanted byproduct of our intellectual capabilities that really developed for another purpose. So in a way, that sort of evolutionary context gives me some I guess, humility about our ability to understand the universe, and it also gives me some skepticism about how meaningful some of these existential questions really are. To your point, maybe we should just take a more pragmatic approach and think about how to live a good and happy life. But the line of thinking that you're following, one thing I do get a little bit skeptical of is I think people might follow that path, but then almost follow this sort of Copernican type sense where we have this humble view of, the universe and our place within it, but actually there's still this sense that we have to, because our consciousness is so viscerally central to, it is our entire experience, right? So it's understandable, it's so central and so powerful, that we feel driven to put that consciousness into other places where I don't think it exists. So my personal perspective, and other sentientists disagree with me completely because it's neutral on philosophy of mind and loads of other stuff. But my personal sense is that sentience and consciousness is an evolved class of information processing that happens to have developed in us and the other non-human animals for the purposes ultimately of taking us towards good stuff and away from bad stuff. And the valence drove that. Whereas other people, and I sense you might go a little bit more down this path, have this sense that our consciousness may be more fundamental than that and may in some sense be stitched into physics itself and the nature of reality. I don't know.
To that I will go for
yeah.
So I there's two views on this. One is Greg Good, for example. I don't know if you've come across him. He's a philosopher. He talks about awareness, standing as awareness. It's a very short book, very beautifully written. He's extremely familiar with both Eastern and Western philosophical traditions, and he talks about this primacy of awareness. But then he also says that, if you're a chemist and you're working with molecules, and that's fine. Like, you don't need to abandon your job, and you don't need to speak in this quote unquote non-dual way from this point of awareness. Like, you can still do, he rides a bike without brakes, and sometimes that causes him lots of physical pain, right? All of those things are still they're still just as valid within that domain, right? And it's kind of this like valid relative to what, right? So
but it's not pretending they're in somehow, totally foundational in a definitional ontological sense. It's recognizing that it's in a certain context pragmatically constructs concepts, right?
Yeah. So Ravelli has this great example, like two. It's like, for example, is what you see in the mirror real? Like, relative to what? Okay. Is Pinocchio real? Okay, like as a fictional character written by, I think, I can't remember. Fictional character, sure, right? Within the context of the story, he's a real character. Is he, then there's the whole debate of, was he a real boy? Doesn't, let's not get into that. So it's like, okay, but what's your frame of reference, right? Okay, that's kind of like, it's like within this materialistic frame of reference, we can have a good solid debate about like efficacy and efficiency and what exists and so on and so forth. But if we expect that approach to scale to different contexts, then I think we're deluding ourselves, because clearly, like, and in terms of consciousness and so on and so forth, I like this perspective that's kind of implicitly, I wouldn't say Ravelli endorses it. Actually, no, he does, or at least he did, at least in a video a few years ago, where he talks about time as this macro abstraction on essentially a gradient of entropy, right? I don't know how, that's true, but not very useful. What will I say? Basically, if you zoom into quantum interactions, this idea that there's a forward and reverse direction of time, that's just not, like, you could, the equations are time invariant, fine.
Yeah, they run both ways, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, at the macro level, this comes out as in entropy always increases, sure. So clearly, or their intuition is that time is a statistical phenomena rather than an inherent one. And it's essentially because we don't have the full details of every single particle in that thing. And if we did, we wouldn't necessarily have this quote unquote preferred ordering. So, like, for example, if you're seeing a basketball bounce across a screen, let's say, and it's, well pumped up and a smooth surface, and somebody asks you, is that video running forwards or backwards? You would be like, right, I don't know. Like, it could be running both ways, because in the macro context, right? But when eventually the basketball slows down, you see that there's you attribute that to the direction of time, loss of energy due to heat, so on and so forth. And this is where the movie Tenet really took me for a spin as well, because I was like constantly thinking about these things. I was like, okay, if I saw all the subatomic particles and the little macroscopic transfers of energy, like the bullet going back into the gun wouldn't necessarily seem strange to me.
Yeah.
Right? You start thinking about these really gets trippy as hell. So that's so going back to the point is consciousness might be, again, this statistical macro phenomena, right? So if we saw all the details and we're looking at every single tracking thing, and we can like, oh, where's consciousness? And then we zoom out and it's like, oh, it's there. Like in the same way. Okay, my favorite example, I'll show you in a second. Right, is like if you have a phone screen and then I ask you like, what's moving? So you can say icons are moving, right? But then if I really zoomed in on each pixel and then I asked you what was moving, it's like nothing's moving. It's just the pixels are changing colors.
Yeah.
It's a classic, right?
Yeah, and I love that way of describing it, because again, there are so many conversations where about halfway through you start realizing that you're spending more time on discussing human concepts and the definition of words than you are on the actual nature of reality itself. And I think it's useful to have that humility, and that's partly what leads me to the sense that what we use the word consciousness and sentience to describe is just a class of information processing. But then you could break that information processing down to deeper and deeper levels until you get to the, multi-dimensional Hilbert space. And again, you go back to this shrug question of like, what level are we discussing? And is that a useful context to have use these terms in? But what I'm skeptical of is anytime I feel this urge for us humans to put ourselves or our consciousness at the center of some entire foundational story. I'm much more comfortable with this sense that the things we think are so special, including ourselves and our consciousness, are just another class of stuff going on, rather than reifying it in some way. But
I'm sympathetic to that. But then like when you take this first person investigation of like, okay, what do I actually know about reality? Do I sense like there's light and it's hitting an external object, and then I'm seeing it? Do I actually sense that per se? And it's like, no, my sensory information is just like there is vision. Vision is known. And it's not necessarily something in vision or something, it's just vision is a form of awareness, right? And so like it conceptually makes sense. It ties up with like a lot of loose ends, and it has this explanatory power. But then you analyze your first person experience of space, time, causality, on all those sorts of things, and then you find them, you ultimately just bottoms out in this thing weird thing we called awareness or consciousness or sentience.
Yeah.
And like you try and posit an external reality and you're very stuck because you just can't. So I wouldn't say necessarily like I very much agree. It's like, okay, fine. That is, I will very much grant that. But let's grant that there is an external reality and there's space and time, causality, and all those sorts of things. Then what we can do, then we have like a productive discussion, right? But like sometimes we do need to move or play very close to that line when it comes to issues around personal identity. And this comes straight into like things about, okay, who's conscious, right? This is where the ethics comes in. If are animals conscious? Are people conscious? Like philosophical zombies, that sort of thing. Is a wave just different from the ocean? Like all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, all of these interesting things really just patterns in some other substrate, and exactly. And I think that's the important thing for me is to I think it's useful to use these different levels of abstractions and terms, as long as we just don't kid ourselves that they are the perfect foundational reality, right? Let's remember that they're operating in a certain context, they might apply at a certain level of description. And the other thing that, because we covered so much ground there across this sort of what's real question, and also into just, how to live a good life and how to live a happy life. And your exploration there has been fascinating. And I think on the sort of ontology side, the sort of classic what's real question, there's interesting questions about the supernatural, the natural. What do those words even mean? That you've explored quite richly. There's then the epistemological side, which is more the sort of method of how do we go about thinking about what's true. And that's one space that I actually think is almost more important than the ontology. I think just having the right approach is probably the most important thing to focus on. That's why within Sentientism, I talk about evidence and reason rather than, a commitment to a naturalistic ontology. And part of the reason I think that epistemology can help is if we shift from this sort of human tendency to have completely binary beliefs and insist on proof, and instead think about probabilistic and provisional credences, because I think then even in this sort of metaphysical space, we can sidestep this thing about saying, is this coffee cup real or not? We can say, well, I have a high degree of credence in it because I can see it, I'm drinking from it, I could still be wrong, and it probably is something else in terms of fundamental reality. But at this level, I can have a reasonable credence in the things around me at this sort of mid-level of scale that enable me to operate pragmatically. So that interaction between the sort of epistemology and the ontology, I find interesting too. And in a way, I think the epistemology is probably the more important commitment. But
yes, the only thing I would say to that is there's kind of like obviously the quote unquote Bayesian epistemology where you're assigning probabilities and credences and so on and so forth. There is, I think, equally, I would say equally valid or equally unsubstantiated. It's just like it depends on where you put your axiom, so to speak. There's the approach of critical rationality. The Deutschian Popper-esque folks who don't necessarily put numbers at the foundational level, but they put reasons at the foundational level. Yeah. And I see a lot of appeal to that.
Does it also center on the power and the value of explanation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Right. So explanation, and I like, for example, like it does, like, for example, this issue with the assigning credences and so on and so forth. It's not like that is completely free of contradictions, right? You can run into decision power, like problems like, what was it, the St. Petersburg paradox, and there's other ones where
there's some really tricky stuff.
Yeah, and it just is like where you can have not even just like positive utilities, but like totally undefined utilities. And well, is the set of like, is reality a countable set, and does it have a measure, and that sort of thing, like and
that's partly why I tend to cheat and just use it in a sort of more generic generic sense rather than running the maths every time. But
I think there's this sense of the Thai forest Buddhist teacher. I think he said something like, I think the Thai is my name. So apologies for the Thai listeners, the lack of tones and potentially wrong pronunciation, but it's just like, maybe. Like, climate change, probably. And it's not to diminish climate change, but that probably is just like this little and I wouldn't even recommend, like, most of the time it's more like this internal thing to remind yourself. It's like, yes, like, based on all these assumptions, like,
there's always some there's some question of doubt and some openness, and in that sense a rejection of a dogmatic approach which closes the door to new evidence. So and in the time we've got, I do want to draw you onto some of these other questions and the pieces you wrote as well. So we've talked about your exploration of that sort of what's real question, how to live a happy life, how to live a good life, and you've touched on this who matters question too as well by implication. And that's a really important question for me. And I think it's probably one of the most sorely neglected in moral philosophy, because people will go on to talk about all sorts of different ethical systems, deontology, virtue ethics, feminist care ethics, utilitarianism. The list goes on. And I find them all fascinating. And sentientism, I try and cast as being neutral and pluralistic across them. But most people on the planet seem to make a mistake about who gets to count in our moral scope of inclusion as well. So, and you've hinted at your journey there already, but it would be good to understand your story about how you came to expand and that sense of moral inclusion and how you set it now. Is there a characteristic or a line or a fuzzy boundary, or how do you think about who should be the valid moral patients in our thinking?
Yeah, so there it was just basically the classic was it the inconsistency argument, so to speak. It's like, okay, what are the reasons that you use to exclude some beings from your moral consideration, and would you consistently apply those to humans as well as non-humans? And there, like, I have a whole tangent on logic and contradictions, but there I think there's some value to saying, like, okay, like, if you wanted consistency, and there's, it seems like to be a good thing to aim for. Sometimes inconsistency is unavoidable, but in this case it seems like it's avoidable, and it seems to lead to good ideas, which is, this idea of, if you wouldn't apply the same standard to people already in your moral circle, then why would you kind of exclude others based on that? So for me, it's just a matter of consistency that clearly animals count, right? And like of all the things that I say, like, well, with a shrug about the big questions, this one seems to be like accompanied with the smallest shrug. It's like I really struggle to think of a situation in which like just doesn't seem obvious to me how that would be the case.
And is that because of their classification as animals and our familiarity with them in terms of an evolutionary tree? Is it their capacity to suffer and their sentience? Is there something else?
There's this kinship and this transcendence that comes from knowing the fact that they are like literally related. People are talking about like evolutionary reason. Anything, it gives me literally, I see that tree, and that tree is a distant relative in a very precise technical sense, right?
It's a cousin.
Yeah, that's actually kind of crazy if you really think through the concepts of that and you apply the notion of family to that tree. So that's beautiful, right? I struggle to see more. There's grandeur in this view, as Darwin said.
So does that lead you to grant moral consideration intrinsically to plants as well?
The other, I is sentient. So for example, digital life, it's like, sure, it could be sentient, maybe one day, I don't know, like non-earth life, if that sort of thing exists, sure. So sentience is that thing, but sentience is like, this is why that epistemological and the whole kind of first part of the conversation is so important, is that I very much realize that's a fuzzy line.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We have, you ask me what sentience is, and my big shrug is probably my biggest shrug is like, So my thinking is like, clearly, even if they do matter, they probably matter a lot less than some of the other ones, as far as we can tell. And there's also this notion of blamelessness. Like right now, we don't know, and right now we don't have the tools to answer this question. And so, would someone reasonable in the future criticize us for not being able to advocate for, let's say, plants as being sentient when 500 years times they turn out to be? They're like, no, they honestly just didn't know. Like they were thinking about it, but like they didn't know. They guessed it might be, and even then, given the opportunities and the pragmatics available to them, they did a pretty decent job. Like that's like my bar is kind of low in terms of impact in the world. It's just like, in some sense, it's like this blamelessness. Like,
yeah. Whereas you clearly couldn't say that same thing about, for example, animal agriculture today.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Makes sense. Thank you. So that's it. Does sound like your moral scope is a mix of that sort of evolutionary family connection and that's transcendent sense of connection, but that sentience is an important characteristic to you. And that's another thing that sentientism is neutral on, right? It doesn't say who's sentient or even what it is. It just says wherever it is and whoever has it, they matter. And so that can flex over time based on the evidence we have available.
One more thing, which I would say, even if you don't grant this materialistic point of view, if you're going down the consciousness route, there's nothing particularly, like if you're going down that, and I think as far as I can tell, don't have personal experience with this in a consistent way, there's nothing to identify that with you.
Yeah.
Right. So if you are going down the consciousness primary route, even then you then recognize that the consciousness that's this perspective on is not limited to you.
Yeah.
Right. So like the reason that, for example, I don't feel your feelings is not because you're metaphysically different from me. It's just because there's no like connection in neurons linking from your nervous system to mine.
Yeah.
Let's say using a physical sense, but even if the experience was that, okay, those are perceptions there, these are perceptions here, so to speak. There's just perceptions, and like we could divide them in a strange way, like like we could divide them diagonally across the line, and so if we just choose to divide them in people.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a better way of saying it than the physical thing. But yeah, so like even that would kind of lead you to a similar thing of consciousness pervades everything and everywhere, and this my sense is another thing in consciousness.
Yeah, and again, it's a personal view, right? But I would take a similar line in saying that maybe information processing or physical processes pervade everything. But for me, it only makes sense to use the word consciousness to describe entities that have this subjective experience of valenced happenings, right? So that's, I think, and it's a subtle difference in a way, because I'm recognizing the, universality and the connectedness of all things, and ultimately we're all physics and quarks bobbling around, and there's no magical difference between the information processing going on in my coffee, in a sense, in the sense that the Brownian motion of particles and so on, and the information processing that's going on in my head. There's no magical foundational difference there. But I think it does come back to, pragmatically, what's the sensible way of using terms? And to my mind, my nervousness about this idea of, okay, therefore consciousness is all pervasive, as opposed to information processing or physics is all pervasive, is there can be a risk of ethical flattening. And you can see this happen where people are saying, well, in that case, if this carrot and this pig and this chicken and this human are all really just fluctuations in a quantum field and they're all conscious, everything matters, and then almost nothing does. And I'm like, you've lost this essential thing, which is, I'm pretty sure that rock and that carrot don't feel pain when you stab them, whereas the pig and the chicken and the fish and the human do. So that's one thing I'm nervous about losing, in this sense of ultimately we're all the same sort of stuff.
I know that is like a well-documented thing within, let's say, they talk about ultimate reality and they talk about relative reality. Say the Mahayana Buddhists articulate this the most clearly. I was like, yeah, in the realm of ultimate reality, these things are all the same, right? But that's not necessarily the useful realm to approach on in your day-to-day life.
Exactly. Yeah,
they are very, very clear on that. This does not mean that you have a free license to kill, steal,
exactly.
and cheat.
And a good way of drawing the ethics of that through is, in a sense, if I stab a fork into the back of my hand, I'm quite aware that what's really going on is neural patterns of activation and firings in my brain that at some deeper fundamental level are just the operational level of physics, right? Which is, there's nothing special about that, and nothing intrinsically meaningful about that, but it still fucking hurts, right? And at this level, that, that is a morally salient thing, right? Regardless of the physical configuration of what leads me to feel this way. But
yeah, you can even have that experience one step further, which is again on a retreat, I sitting, meditating, and then my left leg essentially felt like it was in so much pain that it was on fire, but yet just not bothered by it one bit. I was just like, that's a sensation. Should probably move.
Yeah.
Is it getting damaged? I don't know.
And that's a good segue of leading into this conversation about animal advocacy and the animal topic, because that's one of the interesting conversations about human degrees of suffering and non-human degrees of suffering. And there's an inbuilt assumption that most people have that humans experience a more intense and a richer range of experiences than non-human animals, because we're more complex and we're, have a rich cognitive capability. One, I think you can challenge that directly in terms of our capabilities and the richness of what we can do. But I think the meditation thing is an interesting potential counterexample, whereas us humans also have the capability to mitigate our own suffering in ways that aren't available to non-human animals. So, I think it's entirely feasible that some non-human animals could actually experience suffering in a more intense way than us.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So I wanted to come on to this final question of, given everything we've said and discussed so far, how can we make a better future? And you've mentioned already your engagement with the effective altruism movement, which in simple terms is trying to do the most good possible and grounding those efforts in the use of evidence and reason. And while I think it's quite hard to disagree with trying to do good effectively, who wouldn't like that, there are quite a lot of different criticisms of the movement, some individuals within the movement, and some of the ripples of philosophy that come through. And some of those include a sense that it's quite centered on utilitarianism, and that can lead into sort of ends versus means thinking, sometimes a focus on maximization that can be risky, a sense that maybe you can offset or aggregate in ways that certain people aren't comfortable with. So philosophically, people who are more committed to a sense of individuals in themselves, a rights perspective or a deontological perspective, sometimes are a bit skeptical about the effective altruism movement for that reason. Although there's lots of, as I understand it, lots of deontologists within effective altruism as well. It's not as utilitarian as you might think, but that's one class of criticism. There's another class, and we're not going to go into all of this now, right? Because there would be a whole new episode. Another class is that it's quite sort of, it can feel quite neoliberal in its levers it wants to pull. It's about markets and new alternative products, and it's about philanthropy, and it's about NGOs and effective charitable donations. And historically, it's been a little bit less about democracy and governance and policy. But again, I think that's something that the effective altruism movement is shifting around on now. So, many effective altruists are absolutely recognizing the importance of economics and politics. And you might say, well, yeah, I'm glad you got here in the end, right? That's why economics and politics exist, was to try and make the world a better place, But absolutely, those are important things I think the maturing EA movement is addressing. But when it comes to the animal topic, the non-human animal topic, one of the challenges of effective altruism, and again, it's not a thing, right? It's a very diverse movement. But one of the criticisms of its central gravity is this debate about should the movement focus on improving animal welfare or abolishing animal exploitation? And this was a series of pieces you and I think two colleagues and friends wrote on that drew me to your work in the first place. So it would be fascinating to dig into that a little bit, because my sense from talking to people who are involved in the EA movement, I've interviewed quite a few of them, is that by and large, they agree with an abolitionist end goal. And to my mind, a sentientist worldview and effective altruist worldview, either of those, would point clearly at an abolitionist end goal, because when you're looking at the exploitation, suffering, and death for often trivial reasons, look, let's just stop doing that. So I'd be interested in your view about, one, whether there is that sort of consensus about an abolitionist end goal. Even if there is, then there's this question about how do we get there? And do we get there through pushing abolition, or do we get there through welfare improvements and more incremental things that might get there in the end? So, yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts about, what's the right end and what's the right method on this particular topic of non-human animal ethics.
My opinion on the right end is abolition, and not necessarily getting to a point where high welfare animal agriculture still exists. And I mean high welfare as in genuinely high welfare, not the sort of greenwashing that goes on, the humane washing that goes on these days. I kind of in the piece outlined two reasons for this. One is, or maybe three. One is just this basic fact about human psychology. Jeff Sebo points this out really well, articulates this really well.
Another previous guest, by the way. So.
Oh, really? Yeah, nice. Yeah. He says something along the lines of, our moral intuitions seem to be hardwired to think as in terms of rights as a heuristic. And so if we have animals that are eaten, then there's this just purely pragmatic consequentialist risk. Yeah, this is nice thing. It's like that eventually those animals are not seen as deserving of their own consideration, right? And this seems to happen more often than, like, this allowing that concession changes your moral intuitions or reasoning, right? There seems to be something extremely deep and motivated reasoning going on. I don't know how that happens, but it seems remarkable, especially with ex-vegans, where something leads them to eat some animal products, and then their moral opinions change on that, right? Which that seems suspicious, right? You can potentially have a factual situation where that's the case, but even not necessarily. But my point is that this seems to lend evidence to the idea that Jeff Sebo says there's a psychological intuitions tend to be rights-based. Doesn't mean that morality is rights-based. I'm just saying psychologically there seems to be a sticking point there. The other thing is long-term thinking. If you're you kind of want to not just end the current end the current animal exploitation system, but prevent it from re-emerging. And intuitively, it seems likely to me that if you just have a blanket ban on this, then that's going to stand more chance of preventing re-emergence than allowing high welfare systems. So again, very consequential, very pragmatic argument. It's not necessarily like it's easy to understand. And the third one is related to wild animal suffering. And again, it's very much kind of derives from the psychological. So even if addressing wild animal suffering is not physically or dependent, I say physically in the loose sense, physically dependent on abolishing animal agriculture, I think there's an extremely strong case to be made that it is psychologically dependent on those things.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of my reasons for thinking of abolition. I think most people in the EA community it's hard to say how much of the EMA community appreciates high welfare versus abolitionist goals. It seems to me within animal advocacy, like let's say Humane League, all the people they seem to be aiming for abolition. Fine. Within EA broadly, there seems to be this openness to high welfare animal agriculture, which seems to be to me just like first of all unnecessary, like, and secondly just extremely risky for the reasons that I said.
Do you think of sentient beings as just sort of empty buckets of sentience, if you like, right? So they're receptacles for sentience, and we care about the suffering? Or do we care about the being itself and its own perspective? And for me, that's quite an important difference. And part of the reason I talk about sentientism as being compassion for all sentient beings is because it doesn't say only sentience matters. It says all sentient beings should matter. So that means we can take a broader range of views about thinking, not just as, the momentary utility of suffering or flourishing, but we can also consider, the perspective of the individual, the interests of the individual, even the rights, the dignity. You can think about sentient beings in a more individualistic sense, as well as the purely receptacle of suffering thing. And I think that's partly why I see that happening sometimes within effective altruist spaces, is there's this sense of, look, suffering is what matters. And if I can aggregate or offset that suffering in a way that sort of ignores the fact that the individual is still experiencing the suffering and is still going through a negative situation, that can lead you into the logic of the larder, the idea, for example, that if we can have a nice high welfare animal farm where the animals live a positive, happy life and then are quietly euthanized in their sleep, maybe that's actually a good thing to do because, it increases the number of utility units over time versus another alternative where we're not. And I don't find any of those arguments convincing, because for me, the grounding of any sensible ethical view is to try to put yourself in the shoes of the other, imagine their perspective and take that perspective into account. And I'm not sure that would be convincing to a human who was put into that space and was being farmed. And I'm pretty sure it's not convincing to a non-human animal that was put into that space and being farmed either. Quite apart from the fact that that thought experiment has absolutely nothing to do with the reality of animal farming or fishing either. But again, you can see that sometimes there can be almost an over-intellectualized path that leads you back to justifying something you wanted to do in the first place that I'm deeply skeptical of.
Oh yeah, and this is very common, and happens to this day. I think there's an inkling that it was going to start yesterday as well with a particular well-known personality, and I'm sympathetic to the view that it's not like the individuals. I don't know. In some sense, like I feel like that's a false premise question, right? You're saying like it's not that the individuals are receptacle to suffering. It's because that they're an individual who's suffering that matters. And I'm like, because of all the metaphysical things I said earlier, I was like, I kind of think the individual is not a valid unit in the first place. So that's kind of my take on it, right?
And how do you avoid that leading you to a situation where you don't care about other individuals, where their suffering and flourishing is irrelevant?
As in like there are macro phenomena, right? So clearly like on that level it matters.
And I think that's the claim, right? I'm not claiming that individuals are an aspect of fundamental physics. I'm just saying that as a macro phenomena,
yeah, for sure,
they're morally salient. Yeah,
there's a lot to be said for taking that into account, for sure. I would agree with. I guess I would take an issue with the framing. But yes, yeah, for sure. But I would counter. I kind of would say that is like the reason that the individual matters is because they have experiences of themselves as an individual.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Absent those experiences of themselves as an individual persisting through time, then we can now start to talk about these weird edge cases where these views don't necessarily line up. And I remember I went to Effective Altruist conference last year, and I put in the thing, which was a really good, it's almost like a dog whistle for those who knew. It was like, I believe in person affecting views, but I don't believe in persons. And that just immediately, it didn't attract many people, but the conversations I got out of that were so good. And that's a different topic of almost. There's another way to dice this, which is comparing existence versus non-existence. And it's a tangent, but I think there's ways around that where the idea that those things are comparable, or that existence is better than non-existence, or positive existence is better than non-existence, which is around neutral existence, which is better than negative existence. Like, again, you can all of those assumptions are in some sense equally unfounded. So
Yeah. And my sense of that as an amateur is that I don't think it's a valid comparison to make, because in one of those scenarios there is no moral patient.
yeah, exactly.
Well, let's come on to the method. So if we assume that we've persuaded everyone that abolition is the right end goal, what are your thoughts about, how to best get there, and how does welfare and abolition, proposing, welfare improvements versus abolition directly, balance out?
So my thoughts on this are essentially along the lines of, in the effective altruist advocacy, animal advocacy community, it seems like people have said yes to welfarist approaches and no to abolitionist approaches. And my conjecture,
In terms of tactics, yeah.
in terms of tactics and approaches, and my conjecture is that it should be based on their own standards of rigor and science. It should be yes to welfarist approaches if you want to keep that. I don't particularly care about that, but it should be like unknown out to abolitionist approaches rather than no to abolitionist approaches. So, like, that is a very modest claim that I'm making in some sense.
You're just saying be more open-minded about abolitionist approaches. Yeah.
And the reasons I think that are, obviously, one is just the case for abolition. The other thing that I went into like a remarkable amount of this piece took way too long to write, and I don't think I'd ever do this again. But it was the limitations with the current strategies pursued by the effective animal advocacy community. So, for example, the focus on the high-income countries, which is changing. So I appreciate that, but fine. The optimism around cultivated meat, which I think, again, is changing in light of failed predictions and updates and so on and so forth. But, hopefully precision fermentation seems to be way more, which I didn't really come across when I was writing that piece, but seems to be much better place than the efforts on cultivated meat. And also these very common objections to social political change or individual advocacy, different kinds of individual advocacy. And I looked into the objections, and these objections were usually empirical in their nature. So one classic example is advocating for a reduction in diets works better than advocating for elimination.
So reducitarianism versus advocating for veganism,
yes,
for example.
Exactly. Yeah. And right, this is a very straightforward empirical sentence, regardless of if you set aside the value judgments and the kind of broader messaging. This is pretty straightforward to test. And then you look at the studies that they're citing, and I struggle to find the strength of the conviction within the data or within the things I was saying. And it wasn't even just like me looking at the original papers. It was more like the institutions themselves would reevaluate their own studies from a few whiles ago and say, look, the strength of the conclusion that we drew from this before were clearly they don't stand up to scratch. And so there's a whole bunch of these kind of individual things where I'm like, I look at this commonly held belief, like advocating for reduction or not only using a moral messaging or so on and so forth. And I look at the evidence behind it, and it just seems like, the abolitionists did get some of the things right. Like, you got to give them credit where credit's due, or they weren't as useless. They're like about the same, right? For example, yes, more people will respond to the reduce, but they'll do it by less, whereas fewer people will respond to the eliminate, but they'll do it by more. And so if you have instances like this, right, where the evidence just doesn't really line up with this no against abolitionist tactics associated with abolitionist activists, right, advocating for elimination, advocating for social political change, or a bunch of the other things. And you also take a somewhat you take a fair view on abolitionist approaches, which I found was somewhat lacking. There was and I kind of like, this is not to cast aspersions on the character of the people. I think they just had some bad experiences with some unfortunate caricatures, maybe a few years ago or about a decade or two ago. Fine, but the abolitionists of, there's new abolitionists on the block, and right, there's new kids on the block like me and a bunch of other people, and there's also just people who are abolitionist and evidence minded. Like those people exist, and like there's this kind of I felt like, and this is the thing that's kind of hard to articulate, right? Because the community's amorphous and the beliefs are amorphous. But I looked at funding, I looked at common arguments, I looked at kind of footnotes, and I was like, there seems to be this dismissal which doesn't seem to be quite so justified. So with I look at all the objections in one of the pieces, apart from the limitations, I look at the limitations with current approaches. I look at the objections to traditionally abolitionist arguments. I'm like, these just don't stand up. And then I suggest some ideas, and this is the most speculative part of the piece, where I suggest ways in which the unknown can turn into a yes, right? So this is the part of the piece where I'm like most unsure about, but it's kind of just to demonstrate. I think I wanted to avoid making a case in the negative and not providing any potential avenues for follow-up.
And my sense of it is that, I'm open-minded about there being different paths and routes and ways forward, but we always have to be on the lookout for this powerful human tendency to look for excuses. And so reducitarian can be one, because everyone can say, oh, I'm already one, tick, I don't have to do anything different. Or they might challenge a abolitionist stance by picking the worst possible example of an abolitionist and saying, that's what I'm against. It's like, well, that's not the full breadth of modern abolitionist advocacy. And the list goes on, right? You just always got to watch out for this temptation. Oh, we're going to focus on factory farming because it's clearly the most egregious example, but then there's an implication that non-factory farming is acceptable. And so you just got to watch out for that human tendency to find excuses. And I think that's why regardless of your view on the tactics, the ethics has to be clear in terms of the end goal and as a driver. We can't put that to one side through pragmatism. I think we need to be pragmatic about achieving that clear ethical goal. But that's my view. So if you were to say, so your ask really is just say, look, let's be more open-minded about abolitionist approaches. What are your favorites? What do you think are the best ways of moving towards a better world when it comes to non-human animals in that abolitionist sense?
This is a tricky one, right? So in writing
Even
this
just
piece,
ideas and
yeah. The ones that I wrote in the piece, like I stand by them, but maybe with less confidence that I initially posted in the piece. But if I'm shooting from the hip here, there were I thought one which was quite interesting was this little international rights-based approaches to animal law. Right? Some legal experts have done the reading and the thinking, and they've come to the conclusion that there's some scope for this here, right? It might not necessarily get through, but there's some work that can be done here.
I've rather cheekily rewritten the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights, but there's real world practical things that people are working on to try and implement.
Yeah, the Non-Human Rights Project, that's a classic example.
And even UN initiatives as well, where people are trying to push the non-human animal rights agenda in, even at that level. Yeah.
I'm not going to pretend like that's going to happen anytime soon, or that's slow progress. So it's going to be hard won, but at some point, all the pieces will. My intuition, at some point, all the pieces need to come together, and we don't want that piece of the puzzle to be missing, essentially.
Yeah. And as a tangent, that's another reason why I keep banging on about trying to get the sort of epistemological and the moral scope baseline right. Those sort of human values and beliefs right. One, because I think it gives us that clarity in where we want to go, but also because, as you're saying there, you can run it through every level of human endeavor. Right? You can put it through every level of governance. You can put it into individual choices. You can put it into state laws. You can put it into what's going on at the UN. Right? It's a value thing that should infuse all of that. But one of the other ideas you mentioned in the piece that I personally really like, although I don't, have, it's more of an emotional thing, is the farm transitions idea.
Yes. Yeah. This is actually one of the things that I think has a reasonable. It's tricky, it doesn't have its own. But that's actually probably my favorite idea, which is, we can maybe figure out a way, because farmers are in this horrible situation often at the time, but they're essentially trapped in this industry. and it's taking a toll on their well-being, and they're also seeing public perceptions against them changing. Not necessarily all of them, but it's happening. And there's a really good case to be made there that there's a win-win situation for everyone involved in helping these transitions. Whether or not this is scalable, that's an open question. I happen to know some people who have done entire master's thesis on this and think so, yes, and they are ready to start charity if only they get funding and some consideration, and wouldn't be immediately shot down when they talk about this idea. Like, this is something that's actually happened, and so it's one of the motivations for writing the piece. And let's say it's not scalable per se by like a NGO, like, the third sector. It still might provide some really useful insights for when we start drafting policy proposals.
Yeah.
Right. And so the basic idea is that if farmers are like, we can find easily the farmers who are really just not miserable and not enjoying their jobs, are financially in a difficult position, and offer them a solution, transition, let's say upfront capital, so that they can move their businesses to something that doesn't necessarily harm animals, hopefully restores the environment and climate, ideally in a way that doesn't increase too much wild animal suffering, or all these nice little things that we can do at the same time.
And that's one reason I like the idea, because it's a genuine systemic intervention, and it's one that doesn't just show compassion for the non-human animals that are harmed. It shows compassion for the human sentients that are involved and tied up in these industries, and helps them find a less harmful, better way of living. And again, just politically and tactically, it should also, as you said, present that sort of win-win opportunity. And if we could switch government subsidies from continuing these industries to transitioning them, that would be an enormous win. And it
aligns the sort of third sector's initiatives really nicely as well, because they are very incentivized to find things which are more profitable, right? Like, one of the ways that this would work is that if you find things which are more profitable, and then essentially set up a legal framework where you get some commission of the profits up until your initial transition costs have been paid back, right? So then this would be self-propelling, essentially. Like, there was some example where I think it was WaterAid. They were installing pipes in the homes of people who could afford it. They just didn't have the upfront cash to do so. So they wouldn't necessarily give money to people to do this. They would give out loans so that people wouldn't, and they would essentially collect the money over time. And so this allowed them to install more taps per cost, like per unit of cost. Even if some loans weren't repaid, on average, the money went a lot further. So that was kind of the inspiration behind that. So you see examples of this, like, oh, mushroom farming. Actually, it's now easier and we're making more money. That would be great. Or oat milk. Like, I don't know if those all exist, but by doing this, we are very strongly incentivized to find those solutions which do make things more profitable.
Yeah, agree. And so that's one area that I'm a big fan of. But I think you're right. It's important not to be naive about scalability, and we also need to recognize that ultimately, if we do shift to a completely plant-based agricultural system, we won't need that capacity. In fact, if we switch the whole thing, we don't need a quarter of the capacity. So when we're talking about these transitions, it can't just be beef to oats or mushrooms, right? It's got to, a big chunk of the transition ultimately, if we really do scale it, will have to be into things that aren't to do with food production at all. And it might be environmental, it might be tourism, there might be other things, but all of that stuff has really got to be thought through and planned and funded. It's not just a naive thing about, turn your beef ranch into a sanctuary and start growing oats, right? It's just not that simple. But I love that idea.
Yeah, and absolutely. One of the things, I think public goods bill or something in the UK, where they're like, first time in law, there's some incentive to not totally ruin the landscape.
Yeah, nice idea.
And so it's like, oh, like we could just pay people to maintain the land that they're own. That'd be nice.
Yeah. Instead of paying them to destroy it. Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing I mentioned in the piece was, so I'm at Trinity College in Cambridge, and as an institutional investor, they have a large amount of land holdings and leases on those land which expire in 2060, which is well after the 2015 net zero agreements of the Paris Climate Agreement. And as the landowners, they are just like totally unable to do anything on their end because the leaseholders are in charge of the land. So if you had some sort of, like, again, policy, animal agriculture farmers to these, so the people on the land are incentivized, and the landowners have some legal footing in encouraging people who are on, even if it's kind of like you lease the land and it's just like it's quote unquote yours, but they can do whatever they like with it. If it's like quote unquote yours, but you're a caretaker and you're responsible for its degradation, then the incentives aligns of landowners as well, right? I don't know how you'd go about doing that. That like I totally beyond me in terms of, but it was a very like somebody pointed this out, and I was like, oh yeah, I see your point. That is a valid point. And given that land, or I mean, a lot of these kind of commodities are so densely owned, so to speak. Like if one college can own this much land, uh, it would be very effective for them, to be responsible for their incentives to be aligned with humanities and incentives in that sense.
Yeah, the potential to change. The concentration of ownership is a problem in itself, but it could also be an opportunity, right? If you could get the people who own that land to help drive these switches. Yeah, so there's some hope there, a lot of potential. So you mentioned in passing wild animal suffering, and I know you wanted to share some thoughts about human suffering and intrahuman ethics as well before we wrap up. Did you want to touch on those before we?
So my thinking on this is so in the past year or so, I've been writing this piece, but not necessarily. It's been very much a consolidation and the footnotes and the research and making precise into those words. But the kind of new ideas and my new thinking has been around human suffering. And the classic approach in economics and effective altruism and GiveWell is to use QALYs and DALYs, which are quality adjusted life years, disability adjusted life years, for measuring the badness of things that no one wants to happen to anyone, like going blind, losing a child, that sort of thing, right?
So it's an attempt to capture both the time period, but also the quality of experience. Yeah.
And I think that this is well intentioned, but like empirically and philosophically just terrible. Philosophically, because I don't really subscribe to what's called an objectivist theory of well-being, that your life is good if you have this, and this. I think your life is good if your subjective state of consciousness is right. So that seems to me
ultimately that's
the thing that matters, right? And empirically, people are so these QALYs and DALYs. What part one is that they're based on hypothetical trade-offs. So if I ask you, for example, how I think the question is something like, let's say you have 10 years of living with some difficulty walking, impaired vision, loss of vision. How much shorter would you make your life such that you don't have to, you would live without those things, right? Something along those lines. Now asking you that is actually like pretty silly because of various reasons. Just psychological literature on what's called affective forecasting. If I asked you to do that, you're going to think of all the things that you wouldn't be able to do. Like, oh, I wouldn't be able to go rock climbing, let's say, if I have some difficulty with my leg. Or I wouldn't be able to visit like beautiful mountains and so on and so forth. But you wouldn't really necessarily immediately think of all the things that you'd continue to be able to do.
Yeah.
Right. Like have
looking for the loss
conversations. Yeah, exactly. You focus in on that thing. And secondly, you don't take into account that you will actually get used to it. Right. Just hedonic adaptation, it happens for a good chunk of things. Yeah. And your psychological immune system does kick into place. And thank God for that.
Yeah.
Right.
Across quite a remarkably broad range of actual experiences, and contexts,
including something like the death of a loved one, right? It's not to trivialize it. This is, I had deaths in my own family, and so it's like it dips dramatically, but eventually your day-to-day life is basically the same, right? And
it can be true on the upside as well, right?
Yes, yeah, and that's really important, right?
Unhappy billionaires, and
yes, exactly. And you're not taking into account that, and there's always the unknown unknowns that you find it really hard to factor into.
So is there a better answer?
I think there is. It's not bulletproof by any means, for sure, but I think the answer is I could just there's this great quote by Michael Plant in the recent interview at DevX, which is like, I could look at the crime rates in your area, look at your health measures, I could look in your wallet, I could ask your friends, and then determine like how well your life's going for you. Or the other alternative is I could ask you. It's like, whoa. But in some sense,
because ultimately it is actually your opinion about how your life is going that really matters.
It kind of, right? In some sense, like people are prone to this is a cognitive judgment, and it's prone to its own biases. So ideally, what we'd want to be able to do is just kind of measure their moment-to-moment affect without the cognitive overlay. right? Because somebody might be thinking they're fine, but then once in a while think, oh, I wish I had more money, or I wish I was in this relationship. And therefore they knock off like half a life satisfaction point on a 0 to 10 scale, when actually wouldn't really make that much of a difference. So, but it's a quick and easy measure. It seems to work reliably consistently. There are some issues about, is my 7 the same as your 7? Is a population 7 the same as your 7? Culturally, what's the differences? Is it just a rank ordering, or is a 3 really half as twice as bad or half as good as a 6? Like very valid empirical questions. And on balance, I think this is a good guideline. We shouldn't take the numbers too precisely or too seriously, but if we have something which is like a 3 and we have something which is like a 5, then we have a pretty good idea that, like what's going on there.
Yeah. So in simple terms, it's just ask people.
Just ask people.
Yeah.
And I get so much, like, not I personally, but the community gets so much pushback on this. It's like surprisingly, it's just if I didn't find it so funny, I'd find it really upsetting. But taking quote unquote happiness, or let's say well-being, seriously, leads to not only just the way that you measure these things, right? Then you run into this other philosophical issue, which I love, which is how GiveWell does its moral weights, and it just essentially assigns what multiple of doubling a person's income do you think that this particular outcome is worth, like extending life by this much time, like 40 years, let's say, or curing someone of blindness, or preventing all these sorts of other things, right? And they just pull these estimates together, and I look at that and I'm thinking that's not a methodology. That's an opinion survey.
Yeah.
Whereas the methodology, I think that again, this is a lot of it's influenced by the work of Happier Lives Institute, where they really go straight for the quote unquote jugular of the question, which is like, how bad is death and who is it bad for?
Yeah. Now, and I'm quite sympathetic to that. And it is, in the human space, it's led to people taking much more seriously initiatives like dealing with mental health interventions, and even meditation, teaching meditation, right? So the idea is, let's go right to what we care about, which is the subjective experience of the people we care about, and let's work there. And I think there's a lot of power in that, a lot of value in that. My only nervousness is there's an undertone that sometimes comes through along the lines of, look, we don't need to work on global poverty anymore. Just teach everyone to meditate and they'll be happy in poverty. And I mean, I don't think anyone ever explicitly says that, but there's a sense, I worry there sometimes, that it can be a little bit of a let's sidestep some of the more practical physical issues and just sort of teach everyone to accept the suffering they're going through.
Yeah, and I think that comes to, I think I understand that. I don't think practically there's a few ways to approach this. Practically, I don't think that would end up being borne out by the data, right? I think there's like a very good chance that if you were able to, but that being said, I don't think we need as much material progress as we think we do, right? As far as I can tell. You need enough so that you're not constantly in war and all that sort of thing. And maybe even then, like, there's some people who are like, actually war forms these close communities and bonding. And so in the long run, whole different subject. I wouldn't advocate for that, but it's this idea that all trauma is bad, right? All trauma can lead to trauma. Is lots of suffering for sure, but there can be growth as well as stress. And this is obviously not a way to say that one should advocate for traumatic experiences. No, definitely not. It's more to say that there's something interesting going on there in terms of how humans adapt and what matters to humans. That if we can extract that and scale it up and deliver in a way which doesn't require all the negative side effects of and where material progress. There's this thing by. Yeah, and so my second thing is, I think it comes from this attachment or this assumption that like material things improve. And there's a whole debate in economics about what's called the East Island paradox. As nations have gotten richer, they haven't necessarily gotten happier. And the economist Kate Raworth, who's famous for donut economics, she has a really lovely line which says, we have right now economies that are required to grow regardless of whether or not they make people thrive. and instead we should be aiming for economies that make people thrive regardless of whether or not they grow. And that to me is like, that is a very policy level thing in some sense, right? It's not necessarily about the individual micro interventions. That's a beautiful sentiment, and I think that's something that we should aim for.
Yeah.
And the last thing is just like, this is the last thing is it's an intuition that's uncomfortable, but why is it uncomfortable? Like, you actually like, and it's clearly the case. Not everyone in poverty is miserable, and not everyone miserable is who's miserable is in poverty. So like, that's a kind of personal question for people who find themselves troubled by that, is like, what really matters to me? Is happiness the only thing, or is it just one thing?
Yeah. And I think that's the safety mechanism, is to check that concern is genuinely for the perspective of the other, because there is a real risk. And I think you can find this in certain aspects of the environmental movement, in the degrowth movement, in that thinking, which says, look, material wealth and economic growth is not as important to human thriving as you think. So I, as a pretty rich person in a really comfortable life, I'm going to tell the 4 billion people who are struggling, you shouldn't develop, right? You shouldn't grow, and you don't need wealth, because you don't need that to be happy. Now, no one really says that out loud, right? But I think we've got to be really careful to watch for that tone and that implication, because it does run through some of those movements, and it comes from exactly what you said, which I agree with, which is ultimately it's the happiness and the thriving that matters. It's not the dollars in the wallet. But I think we've got to be really careful about that, because I see that coming through as a theme in lots of places where people ultimately are implying, I'm comfortable where I am, but you lot need to stop growing and striving for better lives. Find a different way to be happy.
A good way to get around that is to work with the communities and with the nations that, right? And just say, look, you have these options. And I think that, let's hope that people agree that, happiness matters. Well, it's on the assumption like you have a community or a nation where they agree that happiness matters. And just say, you have these strategies available to you. You could pursue more material development, and this is what will cost you. And you could pursue just like being content, or find these things. And I don't think maybe there's this other implication that you would get like this would be the end of all material and technological progress. So no, I just definitely don't think that's true.
Yeah, there are just better paths.
Yeah, it might be a bit slower, and maybe there's the growth economists would be like, oh no, if you go from 3% to 2%, then it takes like this much longer to double. Okay, fine. If you don't subscribe to that idea, then eventually the improvements will come, and it will come about because people are just tinkering and they're happy, right? And they're playing with these things. I think it was David Graeber who said and David Wengrow in the on everything, like the agricultural revolution wasn't really like a revolution. It took like 10,000 years or so, and it sounds like people were just play farming quite a lot of the time before they actually managed to selectively breed themselves into not being able to move.
Yeah, and ultimately, I agree. Right, what matters is people's happiness and their suffering, and I also agree that the best way to understand that is to ask them. Yeah, and also
with the understanding that sometimes they can be mistaken. I would say.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But also to ask them what they want to do about it and help them with that as well, not sort of impose from a distance and with a spreadsheet from somewhere else.
And this is why I like the HLI approach, where they don't say necessarily that, okay, this is the approach, like, okay, deprivationism, the death of a 5-year-old is worse than the death of a 25-year-old, let's say. Whereas time relative interest account is like, no, the 25-year-old has a conception of themselves and their selves persisting over time, and therefore more interest in living than it's likely that a 5-year-old might. And so therefore that, or then you can have the Epicurean, where it's like, well, they're not around for it to be bad for them, so it's not that bad. It's just the effect. And they don't prescribe one. They're like, okay, on these different views, these are the different conclusions. So if you can choose the view that you want and just be clear about that. But these are the implications. And then sometimes you get a surprising result, which is like therapies on this view, regardless of which one of those options that you take, in terms of subjective well-being, life satisfaction, improving people's lives through providing low-cost group therapy, specifically women, can result in a greater net benefit to life satisfaction than providing inside-to-side bed nets, right? And that's regardless of the philosophical view that you take. Obviously, numbers and all that uncertainty baked in there as well. But that's a very surprising result, right? And that's one of the most interesting results, philosophical results I've seen in a long time.
Yeah, and it cuts through to the heart of that question of
And it's so this is one of the things that I think is just occasionally in effective altruism, you just see this work which is so clear and well defined and so illuminating that you're like, oh, this is why, like, this is something that only the EA movement could have produced, right? And is that sort of that kind of result. But this doesn't necessarily mean that like micro interventions are the way to go. So I'm running a course on this, and this is not as an expert. This is just someone who's interested and did a little bit of reading on this. There's micro interventions, there's policy interventions. It's not just about eliminating suffering, but also potentially thinking about what improves well-being.
Yeah.
Right. So public spaces, and this is where things like democracy and all that sort of stuff come into, and the incentives line up as well. So Richard Layard is an economist in the UK who went to the Labour government and said, this was back in 2008, look, people who are depressed take time off. When they take time off, you lose tax income from the work that they could have been doing. If you provide therapy for this much, it pays for itself in 2 years' time. Please fund this on the NHS. And this became the first government program to do that. Now, that's not a well-being argument. That is a purely economic one. And it's brilliant because,
it's a win-win, whatever your perspective, right?
Yeah, like 6 to 8 years later, I'm on this program and benefiting from this. So, like, that's huge, like, to the sort of impact that has.
It's hopefully you can find positive interventions like that, which are great if you care about the people, but they're also great if you just care about the money.
Exactly. But there's the other thing. Even politicians, I think, a pretty good predictor of, or I can't remember off the top of my head. So everyone listening, just take this with a pinch of salt or look this up. But Richard Layard also argued something along the lines of, like, the best predictor, one of the good predictors of whether or not you get reelected is just the life satisfaction of the population. Is like better than unemployment and all that sort of thing.
Yeah,
and so like
direct correlation.
That aligns the politicians' incentives perfectly, right? Or pretty well. So it's just little things like that where you just find them and you're like, huh. And yes, getting to the point of more out there things, there's things like technology and meditation and psychedelics, which this is where the science really needs catching up, right? And this is where you kind of want that evidence and reason, regardless of ontology, because there's going to be people who are doing lots of meditations. If we manage to scale this, or the technology enables this to happen at a non-glacial pace, or you do a psychedelic thing supervised under a therapist, and for some reason suddenly you are just like seeing fairies in the world, like you just are. And we can try and convince these people that they're not, but they don't necessarily have that kind of skeptical attitude that some people do. And so clinicians will need to be able to essentially take an ontologically neutral perspective. And this is not I can't take credit for this phase. This is from Daniel Ingram at the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, EPRC, who is very much advocating and pushing for this and saying, like, we need diagnostic codes for these things. We need to be able to figure out what's the right thing, what's wrong. We need to be able to help people on these things. And like, I've been in situations where like someone is just waving around some incense and like doing some weird, like quote unquote channeling energy stuff through my body. I have no idea if that's quote unquote working per se, but it did make me feel better, right? And at that time, that was the only option available to me, right? And it's not like science has yet to produce a better answer.
Yeah. I ran a Twitter poll recently, although it wasn't particularly big, asking people who'd had psychedelic experiences whether they interpreted them as just a new way of understanding the plasticity of human sentience and the range of possible experiences that this hardware can run, or whether it made them think about reality itself in a fundamentally different way. And it was only a Twitter poll, right? But roughly, I think 3/4 were in the first camp, who are still quite, okay, naturalistic. This is just the weird shit my brain can do. But there was a quarter who are like, oh no, I've seen things in a fundamentally different way. It's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in some sense, like I kind of get back to this thing of,
Yeah.
like
that ontological neutrality.
Like if I have a friend, I mean, like I know monks, for example, was just like, oh, sorry, I was just a bit distracted by the fairies in the corner there. It's like, but in all other sense, they're like a high functioning individual.
Yeah.
There's an element of pragmatism which is maybe a bit too strong there, but it's just like,
yeah, I think so too. And as long as those beliefs aren't, causing them to harm others needlessly, right? As long as those fairies aren't telling them to go out and do terrible things, then yeah, I think a shrug is entirely fair.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this insistence on, like even within like non-duality circles, it's like, cups are real, but like the devas, gods from Hindu mythology aren't. And you're like, on what grounds? If you really believe that awareness is primary, then surely this is like within the realm of possibility. Yeah, that's kind of like where it's a bit of it's just such an interesting space of, if we start taking human well-being seriously, there's so much, and then it kind of goes back to the ontology of like, there's so much there, and then it starts to pick apart the fabric of perception and what's reality and all that sort of stuff. And if we're not careful about this can potentially have bad consequences. But if we are, then we'll have a much more interesting society, right? For sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's been fascinating. Thank you. We've sort of answered what's real, what matters, who matters, how can we make a better world, and we've answered quite a lot of the question with a sort of pragmatic shrug. But regardless, there's a strong sort of ethical core driving that, and this concern for others, concern for the suffering and well-being of others. And it's been fascinating to hear your philosophical journey so far. And again, thank you for writing that insightful piece.
And thank you. No, I appreciate it. One of the things I got this from a lecturer. He said something along the lines of, he was talking about machine learning, but I think it's about this space in general. If you're going to go into this field, you need a really finely tuned bullshit detector, which really like.
Absolutely, that's another core human skill, is bullshit generation, and we're not so good at detecting it. So
yeah, so I've enjoyed this, but I think I've been served well by what seems to have worked out as a very useful bullshit detector. But yeah, it's been a fun journey so far, and I'm curious to see how it goes. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed this. Yeah,
likewise. It's been a real pleasure. What's the best way of people sort of following you, keeping up to date with your work? Do you do much social media, or
no,
where your posts are?
This is a good question. The boring ones are the Effective Altruism Forum, maybe for this audience, or LinkedIn, or those are the kind of boring ones, but you'll find me there. I'm not too much on social media. I usually use that for my personal life anyway. Yeah, that's probably the best ways to get in touch. I mean, I also do some work, totally tangential, with the Aurelius Foundation. So if anyone's interested in Stoicism, especially starting Stoic societies at their universities, please do get in touch, because we are looking to support that all over the place.
Cool. And you might be interested in my interview with Massimo Pigliucci.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, which I rather cheekily titled, "Should a Modern Stoic Be Vegan?"
Oh, I remember this. No, I think I remember this one. Yeah, no, I watched that. Yes,
I think he's getting there. I think if you and I can keep pushing him, he agrees we're right. He's just gonna, get over those little awkward social norms that are holding him back from the full
discussing
commitment.
the title with him on a Facebook group, actually.
Oh, really? Cool. Well, Dhruv, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Jamie.
Great to have you as a guest on Sentientist Conversations. And please stay in touch. Thanks again.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much. I appreciate this.
Take care.